Before you put them together, you medicate for paratyphoid. What do you use?
I change, but I use trimethoprim sulfur, and I use that, and a lot of times I'll use it a couple of years in a row before I change, but then I'll find something else. But lately I've been using trimethoprim sulfur, but and there's another one, but yeah, I use a medication that's specifically for paratyphoid and E. coli. Okay.
Okay.
And I'll treat them like whatever the recommendation is, 7 to 10 days before I pair up. I pair them up. I don't get another thing. I give them vitamins and that kind of stuff. But I don't give them any more medication. Now, when I quit breeding here in another month or so, before I ever break them up, while the last round is about 3 weeks old, I medicate them again.
For?
Same thing.
Same thing.
And the reason is, when you quit breeding and break them up, you immediately throw them into tremendous body mold. That puts a heck of a stress on them. Nearly 90% of the birds I'd lose, especially the hens, would be right after I broke up. Because your body just goes to pieces. They throw all those feathers off. They've been feeding youngsters. They're down. And I think that's important to medicate beforehand. And I always medicate before I break them up. That's the only time these breeders get any kind of medication.
And it's just that sulfite. You don't use any kind of 4-in-1 or nothing like that for...
Any what?
4-in-1 for canker, cocci, none of that?
No, and I don't believe in that 4-in-1 stuff much. It's too, I don't know, it's just not specific. Another thing is, since I've been using this thing...
Apple cider vinegar?
I don't have a canker.
Yeah, I don't either.
Now, I'm not saying that did it, and I've heard guys in Europe argue both points of that. We've talked to them. Somebody said, well, they quit using apple cider vinegar because they think they lose their immunity. I'm not saying I won't get canker, and I'm sure I could maybe have a baby that died in the nest. It might have been, but I never see canker in the throat. And
I've never seen it. I don't even know what it looks like in person.
well, it's a problem with it, and if you get it, but a lot of that stuff, Jason, if you get it in your loft, that's like that paratyphoid, and you'll bring a bird in that may be a carrier of it, and it takes you years to get down your loft. But if you'll start them on that vinegar, keep them on it, and do that medication regimen, in about a year or two's time, you just wipe the mess out.
You said how much apple cider vinegar per gallon?
4 tablespoons.
Okay.
That's a lot of apple cider vinegar. That's the cheapest medication.
Yeah, that's
that I've
super
got.
cheap.
Whether it's apple cider vinegar or imitation apple cider, don't make a difference. It's a vinegar. Because what you're doing is acidifying the water. Let's see.
And good for gut health.
Yeah, and when you look at a pigeon, and I'm not a vet, but if his droppings are all right, he's probably not got a gut problem. It may be a respiratory problem. And so then you can treat for respiratory. And I will treat for respiratory. Now, that's not the medication system I use on my flowers.
So what do you do whenever you see water droppings in your flowers?
It depends on well, first thing I do is look, see what the situation is. If they hadn't eaten, or if they just come off a race, or if you've just paired them up and they're fighting and carrying on, they're water. But get a stable thing. And if I see real watery, usually that's what it is. It's just real watery. Now, if it's green, and I'm not seeing that because I'm using this vinegar stuff, but I medicate them for respiratory. I'm not medicating them for paratyphoid and stuff unless I see one sick.
And how often do you medicate for respiratory, and what do you use?
Before I start flying the season, I'll treat them for 10 days with Doxy T. And there's some other stuff too, but Doxy T is just a good, easy one. Now, that is a combination drug. But I don't use that 4-in-1 stuff, and I don't treat for canker. And I'm not saying you don't need to, I just don't, because I hadn't had it. And I think that vinegar is what. I tell people that, they don't believe me. I mean, they think, I mean, it's not, and it won't cure it. If you got it in your loft and you start using that vinegar, it ain't gonna cure it. You're gonna have to medicate them. But whatever I put in that water, whether it's vitamins or medicine, I get the vinegar too. Because in that book, that guy said that even with probiotics, now that's the other thing I do give these birds. Once a week, I give these birds, my breeders, vitamins and probiotics.
You put it in the water or on the food?
I put it in the water, and because it's easier for me to control. And I put it in the water, and I do that once a week. I give them vitamins, probiotics. And I do that, normally I do that on Mondays. And that probiotics is another deal, it's a long-term deal, but I think it helps it. And I think that's really important on young birds. I do the same thing on my young birds. My race team out there, normally on Mondays, I give them vitamins and probiotics, same way. But on the racers, I don't treat for paratyphoid because I don't see it in them, and I don't raise out of them a lot. Now, when I go back, after the races, I'll let those racers pair up. I'll watch them. If I see anything unusual, I would treat for it. But those racers are in top shape, and I don't race. I raise one round before I start racing. I may or may not keep the babies, but they're in good shape then, and you're not putting a stress on them raising a whole bunch of young birds. I think when that paratyphoid gets them, if you use that vinegar, is when you're really stressed on the babies.
So how do you determine what birds go from racers to breeders?
Only the good ones.
What do you determine as good?
To me, I race for the 500-mile races.
So what wins the 500?
Not necessarily wins it.
What is most consistent from the 500?
Birds that have flown 4 directions from 500.
Ah, okay.
And those are hard to come by.
Because you got to wait 4 years, and they got to come back 4 years, and they got to come
But
back.
if they make 4 years, I've got birds. I'll show you one right here that never won a 500. But she's a honey. She's in this other pen. 4 years, 500 miles. Sometimes she was a second day. She wasn't always a day bird. But if they consistently come from 4 directions for 500 miles, number one, they're showing you they got something. They got it up here and they got it in here. And you can look for physical characteristics, and that's a whole nother subject. And believe it or not, I'm old, but I've been studying wings and watching pigeons since I was a kid. I guarantee you, I have seen the evolution of the different type shapes of pigeons in that time. And I can show you examples of it right now, but anyway. But let me show you this little hint. And that's the other thing I tell somebody about pigeons. If you want to learn about pigeons, every time, number one, look to see who you're talking to. Because there's some guys that have flown pigeons 20 years and got 1 year's experience 20 times. And there's other guys that have flown 5 or 6 years, but they got 3 or 4 years experience. And that's the people you want to talk to. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're winning the races right then. You got to look at their loft location where they're flying. That's another subject about that we don't do. We recognize the champion for that year. With electronics, what we need to be doing is recognizing, and of course a little small club like ours don't work, 4-year average. And you don't qualify until you've flown 4 years. And then you get your result, a 4-year average that year. The next year you dump the old one out. You see what I'm doing, the latest 4-year average. When you look at that, when you're flying 4 directions, that's when you'll find out who's flying pigeons. And it may be a guy that never won a race all those 4 years, but he's always there. But anyway, those pigeons that I put in my breeding log, now I will stop them. Kathy, I was a CBS pigeon, a really good pigeon out of the Cannibal line. And I raced her, and she won 3 300-mile races as a young bird. I didn't take a chance. I put her in there.
He stuck that one.
Yeah, she was so much better than
Right.
And it lucky. She turned out to be a tremendous breeder. I had another hen. Cassie was my best breeding hen, and one other hen called Guinevere was the best long-distance hen I ever had. And I didn't realize it. The reason I stocked Kathy, one day I woke up and realized on my race team out there, I had 7 birds out of 1 hen. And a lot of them had been around the clock already 4 years. And it was a hen called Guinevere, and she was a long-distance hen and bred me a lot of good long-distance pigeons. But so I didn't make that mistake with Kathy. I'd like to have taken Kathy further, but I couldn't take a chance. But anyway, let me show you a hen that, and I've got in my loft now, the majority of my birds are sons of Guinevere and sons and daughters of Kathy.
And what line was Guinevere of?
She goes back to Arden. It goes back to my old family, the Huskins. I started following them in. If you follow them back far enough, she's got 522 in the line, and all that Guinevere line goes back to 522 and all that. She was basically, later years, she was more Arden based because they're long distance pigeons. But there's no such thing as a pure pigeon. Hey, Vercommon, hot name. Vercommon's pigeons aren't straight Vercommon. You go to his loft, they're everywhere. But the line, that's what you got to look for, is the line in that. Just like my loft. If you come in here and say, well, I've had them 60 years, here, this would be a good pigeon. The Kathy line and the Guinevere line, if you know what lines to go for, that's the deal on Cannibal. Because of Rick. I knew what the Cannibal line was because I'd been over there with him several times and he knew it. But anyway, I'm going to show you what I was going to tell you. Jump around. A new guy, when he comes in the loft, the first thing he needs to do if he wants to learn pigeons is say, look, see who he's talking to. And you say, I'd like to see your best racer, and I'd like to see your best breeder. And don't make any difference what the guy tells you about him. You look at his best ones. And if you do that enough and you handle that thing enough, all of a sudden it may be 2 or 3 years when things will start to come into your mind and you won't even know what it is that maybe, but you'll know it when you feel it. And that's the best advice I can give somebody. But now this cock is a son of Guinevere, okay? Well, when I woke up and realized Guinevere had 7 kids out there that had been culled, no telling them how many races they'd had. Oh my God, what a jewel I got. Well, she didn't live but another year or 2.
Oh.
So she's old by the time you identify them. So that's the reason I didn't take a chance on Kathy. This cock is out of Guinevere. He only flew to, at that time, he had flown 300. He was a yearling, I think, when I stopped him. 300. But his brothers and sisters, no telling how many of them have flown 500s. And he is a true long distance pigeon. And I stocked him. He'd only flown 300, but generally they're 500 miles. This is a cock. And there are some things in common on long distance pigeons. But anyway, he doesn't handle much, he's getting old. I didn't breed out of him enough until last year. And 5 of the 6 best, 3 out of 6 best young birds I raised last year were out of him with 2 different hens. But I didn't breed out of him. I had too many breeders, and like I say, Kathy, Guinevere was gone. But anyway, and he's old. But that's the result of it. Now, this hen here is the Gordon hen that won the 2 500s 2 years in a row. First time she was the only daybird. Second time there were 2 daybirds, and she still won it. That's a tremendous flying hen. She's Gordon. I didn't breed her. She came from John Wagner. But, anyway, that's why I can't quit raising young birds.
Right.
I woke up and realized, man, I got to get that long distance stuff together. That cock's getting old. Now, he's got a brother right here in this pen. This is not. This is the hen. The brother's a blue check. I don't know how many 500 mile daybirds he's raised me. He raised a bird at home at 11 o'clock at night and won the 500. But I want to show you the hen that I think she's out in that hen out there. Most of the time, Jason, you don't wake up and realize what you got till they're gone. And do the best you can. But most of the birds in here are either direct children out of Guinevere that have flown, or Kathy, and there's a couple of them in here out of Kathy that hadn't flown. Last year I raised that because I knew she was getting old. I hadn't flown, but they're mainly birds that have flown. Well, I want to show you that hen that and here again, some of these birds are birds that I was buying new birds and breeding out of them and not
Testing what you got.
Yeah, not breeding out of them that I already had. she's a 13. And she's a mixed up. If you follow her back far enough, she's got that husky in there from years ago. But nothing necessarily special. But there are things you look for that are in those long distance pigeons.
For example?
Number one, you don't see very many really big pigeons that are
Long
good distance
distance.
pigeons. Small to medium. Now there are some big ones, some fairly big ones that are good. And there are some that flew good as a year-old and 2-year-old and then got so big later. I had a cock called the Pago cock. It was an Orden cock. Too big, it didn't like him. But he bred a bunch of good 500-mile birds. Here's what I look for in a medium size or small. I'll cull a big one before I cull a small one. If that's what I want a short forearm.
Explain that to me.
Right here, there's a bump. And right here, there's a bump in a joint.
Okay.
And everybody's different. But through the years, this is how I handle a pigeon. First thing I do, I put my finger right there, and when it touches right there, when it touches right there, and it touches right there, I notice how far that is. Okay? And all this is relevant. You got to handle a bunch to realize what I'm saying. A short forearm, if it's a big pigeon, he's going to have a longer forearm than a short one. But it's got to be in relation to his body. And there again, you just got to handle them and you'll get it. But I want a short forearm. Through the years ago, those Sions and things that you hear the guys talk about that we flew, and they fly in 1,000-mile races, they'd come home 3-4 days later. Most of them had long forearms. They could fly, but they weren't fast. The shorter the forearm, the more speed they get. And it can get too short, and he doesn't have the energy to fly 500 miles.
So a bird this size, based off of your finger, where would you want?
Well, my finger's different than yours, but if you'll feel, I put it right there. This hand hits me right there and right there. And now that's not a lot of difference, but when you hit one that's out there, and it's the same size pigeon, that's too long for her. But in a minute, I want you to hold her and feel it, and you feel it. The other thing I look for is I won't step in the wing. Now, you can't tell right here. She's just dropped that, and it's not grown out. Okay? The bigger the step, the faster the bird. But because they get less lift and they have to fly faster. The long secondaries give them lift. And if you'll watch buzzards fly, they got a long forearm and long secondaries. Watch a duck. And it's all relevant. If you get it too short and the bird too fast, it gives out and can't fly. It doesn't have the stamina to fly 500, so it's a balance. But I want a step in the wing, and I'll show you some more in there. And I want the wing long in relation to the body. That's what I look for in the wing. And here's the way I do it. And everybody's saying it's different, but if you do it every time, you'll get the feel. Now, that is a long wing for a pigeon no bigger than this. And if you'll look, you won't find very many of my birds that's got a short wing. And that's the one thing those Huskins had. But they didn't have any muscle. My Huskins were, Harold Dunlap used to say, Willeford, I don't know how the hell you find these little skinny pigeons. They didn't have a lot of muscle. And now they would do it, and they had the tenacity to give it to you, and they'd come on the day. But you wouldn't get them back for 2 or 3 weeks, and usually you wouldn't get them back the rest of that season. Another thing is I like a fairly strong back, now, although I've seen a lot of weak back pigeons that are good long distance pigeons, so I don't pay a lot of attention to that. And there's something else that I look for, Jason. You hear guys talking about tight vents. You don't want them real wide, and you want them fairly up close to the end of the keel bone. I don't want them real close to the keel bone, but the one thing I do want, when I come off that keel bone like this, I don't want that vent hanging down, that vent bone hanging down. When it comes off of that, I want it to come up on line. If nothing else, or up, not down. And then I want you to handle this, and you'll kind of feel. She's got a pretty good back. She doesn't have much muscle. But long distance pigeons, it's not volume of muscle, it's the type of muscle, but they do need muscle. Those old Huskies work hard like this when you handle them sometimes. So what you want is a long long wing, short forearm, and a decent step. That's too much step. If this was the number one primary, that's too much step. It might do all right for a fast race, but it's not going to do good for you got to have a combination. You know, you got two extremes. And you know, the other day I mentioned, I don't know if you were there when I mentioned the mail about I sent that hen that had dropped 2 flights. The week before she was my first bird. She dropped those 2 flights in each wing, and I wanted to see how she did. She was my next to the last bird.
So it makes a difference.
Yeah, well, you
Unless
can't tell.
You just
about,
run into something.
Yeah, you know, I mean, you know, scientifically, but it sure makes you wonder. Okay, now, the other thing, and I don't knock them for this or don't one or the other, but I like to see tenacity in a bird. Some of them have it, some don't. Some of them show it different ways. Okay, all right, now let me let you handle this bird.